Hello, welcome to Train Signal. This is the Installing System Center Operations Manager 2012 lesson in the System Center 2012 Operations Manager Training course. In this lesson, we're going to go through the process of satisfying all of the necessary prerequisites that we discussed previously in this course, and then move on to actually installing System Center Operations Manager 2012. Well, we talked about all of the software and hardware prerequisites earlier in this course. There's a couple of other minor tasks we need to deal with before we actually move on to installing SQL Server and Operations Manager. First of all, there are some required accounts that need to be created. Best practices dictate the use of a number of specialized accounts. This should be created before you install Operations Manager or move forward at all with the process. These accounts are created in a way that provides the most security possible unless otherwise noted, and I'll talk about what that means in just a couple of minutes. Specifically, to get started, there are 4 accounts we need. I should note these are all domain accounts that will be created on the domain controller. The first one is what's called the Operations Manager Action account. This account is required and it's used to perform management tasks on behalf of the management server. So once you deploy the Operations Manager agent, it needs to be able to have access in order to be able to perform certain actions on the system. That's the purpose of the Operations Manager Action account. From a best practices perspective, this should be a domain account without domain admin rights. However, it has to have local administrator rights to every machine that's being managed by Operations Manager. Next, we have what's called the SDK account. This is the account that will be used to access the Operations Manager and data warehouse databases on the SQL Server. This account has to be a member of the local administrators group on the SQL Server itself. And then we have the reporting account. This will be an account that allows users to run reports. And finally, we have the SQL Server service account itself. This will be a domain account that the SQL Server services will use to operate. Again, with SQL Server, from a best practices perspective, it's recommended that you run the SQL Server services with a domain account, not necessarily a domain admin account, but a domain account. I'm going to make an assumption here that you know how to create accounts in Windows, and you should create these accounts in your Active Directory environment before you move forward. From an installation process perspective, we're going to be installing Operations Manager for this course onto 2 different servers. The first server will be the SQL Server, and it will hold the operational database, the data warehouse, and reporting services. I've given this server 2 GB of RAM, a 120 GB disk, and 1 CPU. The second server will hold the Operations Console, the Management Server, and the Web Console, and its name is going to be SCOM 12-1. I've also given it 2 GB of RAM, a 120 GB disk, and 1 CPU. I'm also assuming before you move forward that you have no firewalls running on any of your hosts. If you do have firewalls running, host-based firewalls, you will need to determine the firewall ports that need to be open between the various components in your Operations Manager environment. You saw those ports in the prerequisites lesson in this course. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to install SQL Server 2008 R2 on Server 1 and make sure that it's configured as per all of Operations Manager requirements. Once that's done, we'll install the prerequisites for Operations Manager 2012 onto Server 2, and then we'll install Operations Manager 2012 itself and point to Server 1 during installation so that it knows where to find its database server. And without further ado, let's get underway. And here we are over on the SCOM SQL Server. As you can tell, the SQL Server name is right there. And to get started, we're going to add the SQL Server, or the Operations Manager database account that we're going to use for SQL Server to the administrators group here on the system. So we'll go to Configuration, Local Users and Groups, right-click Administrators and choose Properties. Then we'll do Add, and we named this one SCOMDB. So we're going to add that to the local admin group before we get started. We're also going to install the .NET Framework 3.5 Service Pack 1 and the .NET Framework 4.0. So we'll go back to Server Manager. Go to Features. We're going to add a feature. We're going to add .NET Framework 3.5.1 and hit install. And as you can see, that process is complete. So now we'll move on to install the .NET Framework 4.0, which I've already downloaded right here. And click Run. Have to accept the license and click Install. And that's the end of the .NET Framework 4 installation. Now let's install SQL Server. I've already inserted the SQL Server disk into the computer, and it's right here. So I'll simply double click it, and that'll start the setup process. I'm going to jump right to installation. I'm going to choose New Installation or Add Features. And if there's anything missing during this installation, there's a prerequisite check for SQL Server itself that'll tell us that. It makes life a little bit easier. This screen just gives you some setup support information. We're going to click OK to bypass it. You can choose the you can keep the product key you have here or specify a free edition for evaluation. Remember, the product key is specific to your organization. We have to accept the licensing terms. And if you want, you can send featured data usage to Microsoft. It just helps them decide how SQL Server is being used in the field so that they can make better decisions about future versions of SQL Server. And then we have to download the setup support files. If we look at the show details page here, you're going to see that there's lots of stuff here that it checked to see if the system was ready for SQL Server installation. Click Next. We're going to choose SQL Server Feature Installation. We're going to install the database engine. And also, don't forget that we have to install full text search. That's a requirement for the Operations Manager configuration itself. We're also going to choose to take the management tools because we want to be able to manage this instance of SQL Server. For later on, we'll take reporting services because we'll use this system later on for a reporting role in Operations Manager as well. And click Next. And again, we're going to make sure everything passed. There's some things that are not applicable, but everything that was necessary passed, so we can continue on with the installation process. This will be our default instance for SQL Server on this machine. If we wanted to, it would be possible to install this instance of SQL Server as a separate instance on an existing SQL Server as well. However, in the interest of simplicity, I've chosen to just make this a standalone SQL Server installation. It tells us how much disk space is required and how much is available. We've got plenty of space, so I'll click Next. And now, which account do I want to use to run the SQL Server services themselves? Well, I want to use the same account. It's going to be SCOM SQL. We created that earlier on in this lesson. And click OK. Collation should be fine. I like to run with mixed mode authentication. I'm sort of old school about that, I guess. This gives me the best of both worlds when it comes to SQL Server, although it does open up additional security risks. In a production environment with high security requirements, you should run just Windows authentication mode. Although in some cases, some database programs that are out there still require the use of SQL Server authentication. So when I install SQL, I generally just use SQL Server authentication. I want to add our SDK user as an administrator to this machine as well. So that's the SCOM DB user, and this is the user that's going to have control of all the database programs, the databases themselves. For reporting services, we'll just accept the default. And this is asking if you want to choose any kind of error reporting. Sure. Do you want to tell Microsoft about any errors you run into? And again, if we want to see that we have all green, this is a good thing. Click Next. And then click the Install button to continue the installation process. It won't be complete yet for a little bit of time. This can take a little bit of time to install. So I'm going to actually pause the lesson until the SQL Server 2008 R2 setup is fully complete. As you can see, setup completed successfully in my lab, which I am happy about. I always like it when things are successful. If you'd like to review the logs for your own installation, there's a link at the top of the window, but we're looking for the little green check mark. So I'm simply going to click Close. And right now, we are done with the SQL Server side of the house. We're going to turn our attention now to Operations Manager and getting that up and running and connected to the SQL Server that we just installed. As you can see, we're now over on the Operations Manager 2012 server, and I have Server Manager running. Our first task is going to be to install the IIS role onto this server to support the new web console. So we'll click Add Roles from Server Manager. Click Next to skip past the first screen. And we're going to choose Web Server IIS. And hit Next. Then we have to choose which role services we want. In common HTTP features, we need static content, default document, directory browsing, and HTTP errors. Those are the defaults, so we're going to stick with those. Under Application Development, we need ASP.NET. We'll add anything that's required to support that role service. .NET Extensibility, ASP, ISAPI extensions, and ISAPI filters. Under Health and Diagnostics, we need HTTP logging and request monitor, which as you can see are selected by default. In security, we need Windows authentication and request filtering. Under performance, we just need static content compression. And under management tools, we need the IIS Management Console, Management Scripts and Tools, as well as IIS 6 Management Compatibility, which will select all the items here. When we have to install anything with IIS 6, I generally install all of the IIS 6 tools. And then we hit Next. And that's all we need, so simply click Install, and we'll wait for that to complete. Once again, our goal is to see a green check mark. We see that. Installation was successful. So we'll click Close and go back on our merry way. Next, we need .NET Framework 3.5.1. So I'll go to Features, click Add Feature, and we're going to install the .NET Framework 3.5.1. And click Next. And install. And again, green check mark is good, so we'll click Close. Next, we want to install the .NET Framework 4.0. So we'll go here. I've already downloaded, and you can see, the .NET Framework 4.0 setup, so I'll simply double-click it and click Run. And this will look very much like it did over on the SQL Server. So I'm going to simply go through this. But I am going to pause the video because it takes a couple of minutes to install. And that finishes the installation for the .NET Framework 4.0. Next up, we need to enable WinRM. So we're going to open up a command prompt with administrator rights. And to accomplish this goal, we simply type WinRM quick config and press enter. And you're going to see that we get told that WinRM is not set up to allow remote access to this machine right now. Do we want to create a WinRM listener on this machine to accept basically management requests on this IP address. If we say yes, it's also going to create a firewall exception if the firewall is enabled on this machine. And this is a prerequisite for getting everything up and running. So we'll say yes, hit enter, and then we'll be told that WinRM has created a listener and created a firewall exception, so we're in good shape to move forward with the rest of the process. Next, we'll download MSXML 6.0. That's another prerequisite for for Operations Manager. We're going to download the 64-bit edition. Run it. And that's all there is to that. And then next we'll install the newest report viewer. And this is necessary to, as you may imagine, view reports. It's a pretty easy setup. We'll accept the licensing terms and install the tool. Before we move on with the actual installation of Operations Manager, there's one more thing we have to do. Go to the Start menu, Administrative Tools, and go to IIS Manager. Don't choose IIS 6 Manager for this. We're going to choose to modify the IIS 7 system rather, because that's what Operations Manager is using. Select your server, and then in the filter box type ISAPI. And you're going to see that we have an ISAPI and CGI restrictions item here. Double click that, and you're going to see we have two not alloweds. This means that the .NET Framework 4.0 is not able to use these extensions. We want to change this. So select each one and click the Allow item in the Actions area. And then close the window. Now, I've already inserted the Operations Manager CD into my system's CD drive. So I'm going to go to the Computer item, and I'm going to double click the DVD drive and click the Install item. For our purposes here, we're interested right now in the Management Server, the Operations Console, and the Web Console. We'll worry about the Reporting Server later on in this course. And if you want to get examples or information about what each item is, just simply click the down arrow next to each item and you'll get a short description. And we'll click Next. The default installation location is perfectly fine. Then it's going to check to see if we have everything we need, and you're going to notice we have one issue. This system only has 2 gigs of memory rather than 4, but it's only a warning, so we can actually proceed with the setup. This is an important thing. First of all, once you create a management group, you can't change its name, and that's what we're asked to do here, is to create our first management group. So, what do we want to do this? What do we want to call this? Well, I'd like to make sure I avoid certain names. I like to not have the same name as my domain, so I'm not going to call it Global Mantics. I don't like to call it the same name as even my configuration manager a hierarchy, which in this case is GM1. So I'm going to call this GM SCOM. That'll stand for Global Mantics System Center Operations Manager. We want to say we've read the licensing agreement. Click Next. And then I need to provide the name of my server. And as you can see, it found my server. It's going to create a database called Operations Manager. It's going to start it out at a gig. And this is the location on that server at which it's going to create my Operations Manager database, the operational database. Now we have to do the same thing for the data warehouse database. In this case, we want to create a new data warehouse database because we don't have one yet. And it's going to create it called Operations Manager DW, again, with a size of about a gig. And click Next. Which website do we want to use for the web console? Well, we've got IIS installed. There's not going to be any other web services on this machine. So we can use the default website for this purpose. In order to authenticate with the web console, we have to choose what level of authentication we want to use. In this case, we're going to use mixed authentication because it's going to be mostly internal traffic. In this case, users will use their current Windows credentials to access the web console. Now, remember earlier on when we created some accounts in Active Directory? Well, here's why. There's a number of areas that we have to create accounts for, and we can get information about what these accounts actually do by clicking the little down arrow next to each one. The Management Server Action account I've explained before is one that's pretty important in the overall operation of Operations Manager. It is the account under which most of Operations Manager's orders will be carried out on endpoint machines. So this is going to be in a domain account. Notice that this says this account can be configured as local system or as a domain account, except where the Operations Manager database is hosted on a remote machine that is not a management server. The database server we're using right now is not a management server. Therefore, we have to use a domain account here. So this is going to be globalmantics /scomdb. That was the whole purpose in life for this account. Next, we have a data reader and a data writer account. You can create different accounts for both of these. In a real-world best practices scenario, you'd want to do that. For our purposes here, we're going to use the same account. Remember, I mentioned earlier that you should not necessarily use a domain admin account for the action account. For our purposes here, that's fine. However, in a production environment, it's recommended that you push the domain action account to the local administrator groups of all the machines on which you're going to be managing with Operations Manager. We had a problem with one of the accounts. Okay, here's the deal. I forgot to do one thing before we started this process. And what you're going to find is I need to add SCOMDB as a local administrator on the current system as well. So we'll go to configuration. And we'll go to properties. Now, in an ideal world, rather than just throwing the error up there, Operations Manager's installer would simply say, hey, would you like to add this account to the local administrators group, rather than just telling you, hey, you blew it. But alas, that's not the case. The installer logic is not perfect, so we have to make sure that we add this account to the local administrators group so that the Operations Manager installation can continue as necessary. Add, and we're going to add SCOMDB. And that should take care of our little problem. And click Next. See? Problem solved. I like to participate in Microsoft's Customer Experience Improvement Program, as I find participating in community and helping Microsoft and other companies make products better is in everyone's best interests. So I'll choose yes to that. For error reporting, I'll automatically send reports to Microsoft. We do want Microsoft Update. Obviously, it's nice to be able to have as up-to-date software as possible. And this is our installation summary page. Are we ready to go? If you'd like, you can review your installation options, but when you're ready, simply click Install. As you might imagine, this process will take a little bit of time, so I am going to pause the video and we will come back when it's done. And again, we're all about the green here for this lesson, and we got all green. And we also have a note saying setup is complete. I'm going to uncheck that box because we're going to do that in a later lesson in this course. We're going to be looking at the console. I'll click Close. And that's all there is to it. So you got to see a complete demonstration for how to get your prerequisites up and running and how to install SQL Server and Operations Manager in this lesson. Thank you for listening, and I will look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.